So, good morning. I think that we had a panel on China on Gaidar Forum last year. There were fewer speakers, much smaller room, perhaps as many participants as now. Shows that the formal interest towards the Chinese economy is growing in Russia, 18 months into the Russian version of its pivot to Asia. And I think China is really very much on the mind of many people globally and particularly in this town and this country. We have seen the negative dynamics in the Chinese stock exchanges. We have seen the devaluation or attempted devaluation, or we talk what it is, of the renminbi. We've seen the immediate effect on the global commodity prices, which poses a lot of questions and perhaps risks for the Russian economy as well. So China is not that far away at all, both from our budget process and from the plans of large and smaller companies. Today, I'm really happy and privileged to have a very competent and brilliant panel, one of the best speakers you can have from Russia and globally to talk about the outlook for China's economy. We are happy to have Professor Justin Lin, who is professor at the Beijing University and also director of Chinese Center for Economic Research. He used to be the chief economist of the World Bank and senior vice president, first senior economist from a developing country to be appointed at the World Bank. We have my colleague, Mike Pettis, who teaches at the Guanhua School and is also non-resident senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We have Stanislav Voskresenskiy, Deputy Minister of the Economy, who is the key figure behind the Russian pivot to Asia, at least on the bureaucracy side of things. We have Andrei Klapich, who is now Deputy CEO of the National Bank, used to work at the Ministry of the Economy in charge of the long-term planning, and his predictions turn out to be right all the time, despite many people didn't like it. And Denis Kamyshev is first Deputy CEO of Gazprom Bank, an organization which, in my view, developed one of the best market expertise on Asia, starting from scratch just in a very limited period of time. And last but not the least, we have Natalia Stapran, who is chair of the Center for APEC Research here at RANEPA, and is one of few specialists on trade policies in Asia Pacific in this country. So welcome everyone. My name is Alexander Gabuyev. I'm chair of the Russia and Asia Pacific program in the Carnegie Endowment here in Moscow. We structure it like this, if you don't mind. I think I will give each speaker about 10 minutes for a presentation. We'll pose a general question to you at the very onset. Then you speak for about 10 minutes each, no more than 10. Then we jump into discussion, and then we'll leave like 30, 40 minutes for Q&A, if that works, okay? I try to be a tough Anglo-Saxon moderator, so don't be mad at me, okay? Justin, you have the floor. My broader question to you is that we have seen the significant slowdown in the dynamics of the Chinese growth. Prime Minister Li Keqiang and other top-level officials speak about the new normal. So what does this new normal mean for you? How long will it last? And what are the reasons and the major characteristics of the new normal in the Chinese economy? Thanks, you have the floor.
So I have about 10 minutes to talk?
Sure.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the question, and it's a pleasure for me to participate in this session on Chinese economy and as well as its implications for Russian economy. And I think that China and Russia have high complementarity to each other's economy. We know that Russia is strong in advanced technologies like space technology, national defense technology. And also, Russia has competitive advantage in natural resources. And China is a resources poor country. And China's strength is on the middle technology. And on this scenario, if China can continue to grow dynamically, China will demand more natural resources importing from Russia. That certainly will be good for Russia. And China certainly wants to increase its income and move up the industrial ladders from the middle tech to high tech. And in this attempt, Russia can also use its advanced technology to help the Chinese economy. So in that regard, the growth in China will be very important for the sustainable growth in Russia. But today, there's a lot of concern about China's growth rate. The Chinese government now is advocating China's growth rate will drop from average about 9.7% growth rate per year for the past 3.5 decades, down to around 7% growth rate. That is what the new normal means in China. But many people is doubtful about the possibility for China to maintain around 7% growth rate in 2016, and from 2016 to 2020, that is the period of 13 5-year plan and beyond. Many people think China's growth rate will drop down to 6, 5, 4, or even 3%, so-called return to the normal. And if that kind of scenario happened, because the Chinese economy was built around high growth rate, and supposedly if the growth rate dropped too sharply, it can cause all kind of social, economic problems. It can cause high unemployment rate. And China's financial arrangement is that the corporate sectors has very high leverage. And if the growth drops too much, then excess capacity will become a main issues. Non-performing loan may shoot up, and financial sectors will be under stress. And so you can hear all kind of prediction about the coming collapse of the Chinese economy. And whether this kind of doomsday prediction will be realized or not, certainly is a big concern for the world, not only for the Russia. Because for the world, China today is the second largest economy in the world, measured by market exchange rate. And China is the largest economy in the world, measured by purchasing power parity. And in the past decades, China contributed more than 30% of the growth to the global growth each year. And we know the high-income country has not fully recovered from the 2008 crisis. And the global growth is still subdued. And China used to be the engine of the growth in the world. And if the doomsday prediction about China realized, certainly it would be a bad news for the world. And I think that was the reason why the beginning of this year, you see a lot of, a lot of tension in the global financial market whenever there's some kind of signals about the performance of the Chinese economy will send a big wave to the world. But personally, the reason why people are doubtful about the ability of the Chinese economy to maintain the new normal, that is around 7% growth. It's because from the year 2010, the Chinese growth rate continued to decelerate. And last quarter, 2015, the growth rate was 6.9%. And it was the first time since the reform and transition started in 1979 for China to have such an extended period of deceleration in the growth rate. And so many people thought this deceleration was due to the internal structural problems, the growth models problem in China, causing such an extended period of deceleration. And as you know, internal structural problems in general are not so easy to deal with. And so that's the reason why people predict the growth rate in China can continue to drop down to 6, 5, 4, or something like that. And I like to say China is a transition economy from a planned economy heavily intervened by the government to a market economy. And China adopted a dual-track, piecemeal, gradual approach to transition, unlike the transition strategy advocated by Washington Consensus, by structural PE, try to remove all the distortion simultaneously. And by this, certainly, China has a lot of legacies from the past. China certainly has a lot of structural problems, that's for sure. However, I would like to argue the reason for the deceleration of the growth rate in China is mainly external, it's mainly cyclical. And the way is not so hard to prove because we can see in the same period, from the beginning of 2010 to last year, other emerging market economies, including Brazil, India, Russia, all has similar pattern of deceleration. And in fact, the other emerging markets deceleration was even sharper than China. We cannot say because of the internal structural problem of China, causing other emerging market economy to have a deceleration and sharper than China. And the best way to prove my position is to look into other high income, high performing, export oriented economies like Singapore, like Taiwan, like Korea. They are high income economies. They are not supposed to have the structural problem or growth pattern problems. But they also decelerated from the beginning of 2010 to last year. In effect, their deceleration was even sharper. For example, Singapore, its growth rate in 2010 was 15%, but 2015, its growth rate was only 2.9%. And Taiwan, its growth rate in 2010 was 10.8%, but in 2014 was only 3.3%. Korea's, its growth rate in 2010 was 6.5%, but in 2015 was only 3.2%. They were high-income, high-performing economies. They were not supposed to have the structural problems, but they have exactly the same pattern of deceleration, and the deceleration was even much sharper than China. But the only way, so by this comparison, the only way to explain the deceleration in China since 2010 should be common external factors, common cyclical factors. And it's also not so hard to understand what are the external factors, what are the cyclical factors. In terms of external factors, we know the growth of trade in the world has been reduced more than half. Before the financial crisis of 2008, the international trade grew at twice as high as the global GDP growth rate. But after 2008, because the high-income country has not fully recovered from the 2008 financial crisis, their household income did not grow or grow very slowly, so their demand for import reduced dramatically. And as a result, global trade has been reduced less than the global GDP growth. And for example, in China, before 2008, each year export growth rate was about 16%. Now, last year it was negative 2.1%. And so that's contribute to the slowdown in the growth. And in 2008, when you were hit by the global financial crisis, every country adopted certain kinds of counter-cyclical fiscal expansion to support investment. And now those kind of projects completed. But the global economy has not recovered yet under that kind of situation unless you have other new round of fiscal stimulus to support investment. Otherwise, investment growth rate will also drop. And these two factors are common to all countries in the world, and all common to all countries which has a large component like export. And so from this comparison, I think the pessimism about China is unfounded. I think that China can utilize its internal resources to maintain reasonably high growth rate by domestic demand, both investment and consumption. And I know my time is limited, so I just like to say, China will be able to achieve its policy target of around 7% growth in the coming years and realize the moderate high growth rate in China's. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. So what we get is that the current slowdown is common to other countries, so it's not a unique Chinese phenomena. It's caused mainly by externalities as the global economy starts to revive. So we'll see return to the other to the previous dynamics perhaps, and at least 7% growth target is achievable. Michael, you have written and talked a lot first on the domestic structural problems inside the Chinese economy, particularly on the debt issue, and second on the flip side of many positive things we see around China. Do you see any structural internal problems in the current slowdown? What's your take on it? You have 10 minutes.
Do I need to press something?
Yeah, I think so.
Is this working? No? That red button doesn't seem to work. I apologize, but hello? No.
You can use my mic.
Thanks very much. Can I pull this? Ooh, is it working?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for that. What strikes me about China is how similar it is to many other cases that we've seen before in history of what I would call an investment-driven growth model. In fact, since the Second World War, there have probably been somewhere from 30 to 40 similar cases of this growth model. And they follow an incredibly regular pattern. It's it's almost astonishing how closely China has followed what we would have expected from the pattern. And by the way, if you look at the growth of the Soviet Union in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s, it too followed a very similar pattern with many of the same consequences. The way this model seems to work is, and there's a Ukrainian economist by the name of Alexander Gerschenkron who wrote about this a great deal in the 1950s and 60s. And Gerschenkron pointed out that developing countries tend to have two common problems. The first problem is that they lack savings. They lack sufficient savings for domestic investment. And for him, the classic example was the United States in the 19th century that had to import capital, mostly from Great Britain and the Netherlands, in order to fund its domestic investment programs. But of course, importing foreign capital is extremely risky. The second point that Gerschenkron noticed or mentioned was that developing countries systematically fail to invest in productive investments that generate externalities, for example, infrastructure. And he argued that unless some central authority, the government or somebody else, takes responsibility for that sort of investment, you don't tend to get the necessary investments. And by the way, again, he looked at the United States. One of the big myths about the US is that it is an example of the success of free market development. In fact, the US government was very heavily involved in infrastructure building in the United States in the 19th century. So Gerschenkron's recommendations were, first of all, you have to do something to force up the savings rate, and we know what to do. If you want to force up the savings rate, which is the same thing as forcing down the consumption rate, you have to constrain the growth in household income. The second thing that Gerschenkron recommended, of course, was that you centralize the investment, particularly infrastructure investment process. And so a number of countries have followed this model. Now, how do you force up the savings rate? Implicitly, you impose a series of taxes on the household sector that prevents household income from growing as quickly as the production of goods and services, as quickly as GDP. There are many ways you can do it. Brazil, for example, which is maybe the first country that was called an economic miracle in the 1950s and 60s, they did it in the form of very high and progressive income taxes. The Japanese version, which is what China followed, employed a number of implicit taxes, hidden taxes, all of which implicitly reduced the real value of household income and subsidized rapid growth. I won't go through these various taxes, but by far the most important was what we call financial repression. Extremely low interest rates, and as you know, very low interest rates are a transfer of wealth from net savers to net borrowers. And in the case of Japan in the 1980s, China more recently, net savers are the household sector, and net borrowers are the various producers of GDP. The other thing that was very important was the control of credit, which again is part of a financially repressed system, and that credit is directed into investment. Now, in every case that this model has been used that I can find, it has proven very successful in the beginning, without exception. It's generated very rapid growth. In the case of China in the early 1990s, China clearly lacked investment. It had almost no infrastructure, no manufacturing capacity, etc. So what China needed at the time was a financial system that could grow as rapidly as possible and direct as much credit as possible into investment. And investment levels in China were so low that people used to joke that it didn't matter where you put your money, it was always productive. There were no roads, no airports, no ports, etc. Great. But what has happened in every single case in this model that I can find, and I literally cannot find an exception, is that you reach a point where you get investment saturation. And there's a long debate about why it is that poor countries are more likely to reach investment saturation than rich countries. But in fact, that does seem to be the case, and I think for good reasons. But once you reach the point of investment saturation, then you are supposed to stop and switch your growth model. Let me introduce another economist who was a contemporary of Gershon Krohn, someone by the name of Albert Hirschman, a German economist, who's one of my favorite economists, but not as well read as he should be. Hirschman looked at this problem a great deal, and he wondered, why is it that countries, when they need to switch their growth models, almost never do so? He focused particularly on Latin America. And his answer was, I think perhaps not surprising, is that a very strong growth model develops a very powerful institutional structure behind it, what in China are probably called the vested interests. And they create political opposition to switching the model. And as a result, Hirschman pointed out, whenever you have this period of very, very rapid growth and you reach the point of investment saturation, you continue over-investing for many, many years. And when you overinvest, almost by definition, debt is growing faster than debt servicing capacity. If you look at every single case of a country that's had an investment growth miracle, quote unquote, they have every single time ended up in a debt problem. And by the way, let me just make a quick aside here. I hope my next book will be on debt and the problems of debt. For those of you who are economics students, I am really astonished at how poorly economists understand debt. There are so many cases of highly indebted countries that stopped growing, but I often get the impression from from academic economics, that that can't happen, that debt has no impact on growth. I would like to suggest that the history says very, very differently, but that's an aside. As you reach that period of very, very rapid growth in debt, you also end up always with very unbalanced economies. Now, unbalanced growth is considered a bad phrase, but as Hirschman pointed out, there is no such thing as balanced growth. All growth is unbalanced. What ends up happening is systemically, when you've developed deep enough imbalances, then somehow those imbalances must reverse. And there's a number of ways they can reverse, some positive, some negative. So the issue for China is we have long reached the point where investment is misallocated, perhaps, I would say probably on a bigger scale than we've ever seen before in history, probably exceeding Japan in the 1980s. And as a result, debt is growing much faster than debt servicing capacity. Just to give you some numbers, the official growth rate in debt is something we call total social financing, and that's growing at something like 13 to 14% a year. Many of us believe real debt is growing more quickly, but we'll accept that number. Nominal GDP, because when you look at debt, you should look at nominal, not real GDP. Nominal GDP is growing at around 6% a year. Most of us, or I should say many of us, don't believe that debt servicing capacity is growing as quickly as nominal GDP. We think it's growing more slowly, but even if you agree, debt is growing at least twice as quickly as debt servicing capacity, right? And that's clearly unsustainable. So one way or the other, two things are going to happen in China. One is it is going to rebalance demand. Household income as a share of GDP is maybe the lowest we've ever seen in history. We've seen this before, these types of imbalances, and they always reverse. The second thing that we know is going to happen in China is it's going to deleverage one way or the other. Debt levels in China, people will say that compared to the US or compared to Japan, debt is not so high in China. That is absolute nonsense. If anyone ever tells you that, you can throw away the report. You can never compare the debt of a poor country with the debt of a rich country. All you have to do is graph debt to GDP versus debt per capita, and you'll see it's a very straight line. Poorer countries have lower levels of debt. Richer countries are able to have higher levels of debt. And China is a huge outlier for its level of wealth. It has too much debt. So how will it adjust? That's the real question that, the Xi administration faces. And there again, Hirschman has some very useful things to say. Whatever reforms that are implemented by the administration, Hirschman warned us, would be very strongly opposed by the existing elite. And in China, that's been basically since 2008, 2009. We've seen this in the press, the so-called vested interest opposition. So his recommendation was that the governments would have to centralize power tremendously in order to impose the necessary reforms. And in fact, my class at Peking University in 2009 made that prediction. They said the next president will centralize power, otherwise the reforms can't be implemented, and that seems to be happening. But whatever the reforms are, they have to be consistent with these two things, the rebalancing of demand and the deleveraging. And I'm not going to tell you what China is going to do. I wish I knew. I'm still optimistic that they will rebalance in a non-disruptive way. But I want to give you the range of ways that rebalancings have taken place. Look at the United States from 1930 to 1933. The 1920s in the United States had many of the characteristics of China in the last decade. Excessively high savings, very, very high current account surpluses. The biggest reserve hoard in the world in history was actually the United States at the end of the 1920s as a share of global GDP. It rebalanced from 1930 to 1933 with GDP collapsing by 35%. Household income dropped by 19%. Very, very painful. But notice what happened. Household income was a bigger share of GDP at the end of that period. That's one of the ways you rebalance. That's the chaotic, disruptive way of rebalancing. Another way you rebalance is the Japanese way. Japan also had an unbalanced demand at the end of the 1980s, very, very high levels of debt. And for 20 years, 25 years, Japanese GDP grew at close to 0%. Consumption, household consumption, which I use as a measure of household wealth, grew between 1.5% to 2%. So notice again, Japan rebalanced. And to me, historically, those are the range of ways that we have seen rebalancings. They have always occurred with much lower growth levels. Not once in history has it not occurred with what looks like a collapse in growth, but it ranges from a real collapse in growth, negative growth, as in the case of the US, or a long period of stagnation, as in the case of Japan. We'll see the same thing with deleveraging. The options China has, in my opinion, are either it will pay down debt by liquidating government assets, it has tons of government assets, or we'll see defaults. It's hard to imagine defaults in China, except in the case of a very disruptive adjustment, because effectively the whole, almost all credit is guaranteed directly or indirectly. But I think that's what we have to think about when we look at China. It is going to rebalance. The question is how long it takes, and it is going to deleverage. The question is whether that happens in the form of defaults or whether it happens in the form of debt repayments. Now, what people will tell you is there's a third way. Growth can pick up so that GDP can grow faster than debt. That is theoretically possible. I challenge anyone to find me a single case in history when that has happened. I have, in my book, I'm going to explain why I think that cannot happen, but I will even start with a single case in which that happened. Always, debt has to be forgiven. It can be forgiven by being monetized through inflation. It can be forgiven through defaults. It can be forgiven through a number of ways. But one way or the other, the cost of the debt will have to be allocated. But China has a special problem. How do you resolve a debt problem historically? We know how.
Mike.
Am I too long?
Yes.
Let me finish this one thing. How do we resolve historically a debt problem? You always screw the household sector, right? In the United States, we bail out the banks, we tax the households. Europe did the same thing. China bailed out its last debt crisis through financial repression. That's the standard way. The problem is we can't do that again in China, because the only solution for China is the growth in household consumption, and so we can't force the household sector to repay the debt. So there are other ways of repaying it, but one way or the other, China must do that. I apologize for taking so long.
Okay, thank you so much. You can wear your ear devices. I think that the translation devices should be okay. No. The reason you said. Okay. Does it work? No? Can you turn it on?
Can you listen, the interpreter? Yes, sir. Is it working now? Is it? Do you read me, sir? Is translation is coming? Do you, 1, 2, 3? Do you hear translation, sir? 1, 2, 3. Do you hear English translation? Do you hear interpreters? Is it working now? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Do you hear? Well, there might be certain problems, and not only in China. Shall we stay in English? Yeah, we can go ahead in Russian. Yeah, yes. Do you read me, sir? Do you hear interpreter? One, two, three. Do you hear the voice of interpreter? Yes. Do you hear the voice of interpreter? Yes. Okay. Excellent. We switch to Russian language. Andrei Nikolaevich. Having heard two diametrically opposite things, in general, not so bad. There are global factors and there are cyclic factors concerning the Chinese GDP, but it's going to be around 7%. It's going to grow more once the economy in the world gets restored. Another thing is still there is a problem of debts, and China will have to execute a tight landing. And in your opinion, what kind of influence do you watch on behalf of Chinese economy to Russian economy?
Is there danger of this or that scenario? Hard landing, continuation of the growth at the level of 6 or 7% and so forth? Or all this influence of China, which we talk for the recent times, will not really impact Russia, the trading at 12% level, the oil prices, and China for us is not the most crucial topic for our economical policy. You have 10 minutes. Thank you. I would start off not just talking about direct influence of China against Russian economy, because the answer is quite clear. Based on the trading volumes, the influence is rather limited. Although the factor of China from the standpoint of the prices, not only oil prices, but also is also important for Russia. All group of metals, chemical products, forestry products also play important role. And aluminum prices are also critical for China, copper, timber, and the fertilizers. Also, if you look at the prices for the rolled steel, cast steel, the fear of all metallurgists, what will happen when China not only scrap excessive capacity, if it starts preparing the blanks in the volumes, so it will, the steel prices can drop by the factor of 50%. Praise the Lord, it hasn't happened, and hope that it will not happen. And also titanium production, we still continue being competitive. There was a murder of the world aluminum, manganese industry is also challenged. Influence of China is huge, maybe more influence than the influence of the raw material, such as oil and gas, where impact, the influence is growing. I'll come back maybe at the end, but I would start off by talking about China being unique phenomena and very interesting experience in terms of the development and industrialization model. And Michael is correct. You can draw parallel between development, very dynamic development of China in the recent years, this development that was also noticed in 50s and 60s in the Soviet Union, development of Korea in the 60s and even 70s, and all the countries faced with the problem of rebalancing of demand. It's not only demand, But unlike what Gershon Kron wrote, China had very high level of internal savings and at the same time used by way of reforms, especially in 90s and 2000s, strong inflow of capital. And at this time, this problem of China was declared by China for a long time. It didn't advance as it was advanced in the previous plans of the Communist Party of China towards stimulation of internal demand, because the accumulation or savings norm has not changed. We don't have fresh data from this year, but the process started. But it's inevitable turnarounds that Soviet Union experienced in 70s and 80s that will have to be part of Chinese life and economy. It's quite painful process, as we see at the example of Japan, of which Michael spoke, an example of Soviet Union that lost dynamics of the 80s growth and tried to respond, if you remember, the policy of acceleration that it exacerbated this balance on the consumer market because the revenue of population and the budgets. It also played a crucial role in the crisis events in early 90s in Russia. It's not only oil prices drop and export revenues drop. Because of that, I think that the process of rebalancing of demand will not be so soft and problemless, just like you can think now. It's difficult to judge from outside, but as it looks in the official forecasts of the Chinese institutes, the ones we see, obviously dynamics and the slowdown of economic growth can be even more drastic. If you look at the evaluation of the international organizations, they expect 16th year deceleration. It's not going to be 6 and 5, or see the fractions are not so crucial at some time. At what cost this rebalancing of demand can happen? On the other hand, really, and I agree with Michael, the problem of debt, of internal debt and leverage, very acute. If I remember correctly, in terms of the credit to gross domestic product in China, more than 200%, although the sovereign debt, especially of the central government, is not big. We know, based on our Russian experience, our sovereign debt is minimal. External 2.5%, the sovereign is about 12% of GDP, but refinancing is quite challenging and costly process. In China, unlike our country, refinancing of debt and crediting is at quite reasonable rates. More so, within a liberalization framework and stimulation of economics, Chinese National Bank decreased substantially interest rates. However, obviously, certain deleverage is unavoidable, because to continue increase volume of the credits against GDP at such levels is impossible. At the same time, Justin spoke about this problem of bad debts. It exists for 10 years. Everyone was waiting. When do the bad debts lead to serious destabilizing outcomes? But because of the specifics of banks and finances in China, it didn't happen yet. These debts are refinanced. They shoot through bankruptcy of some companies, but there is no reliable assessment. They talk about 20 or even 30% of the credit portfolio, but you can live by, you can get by. The problem is that under current conditions, such as liberalization of certain, you cannot call it full liberalization of the forex rate, but starts moving, even more so, we see certain link between increase of volatility of the forex rate, especially offshore, and what happened at Shanghai and Hong Kong stock exchanges. Under such circumstances, the fall of the indexes by 40% is important signal for the financial system. And I think that the opportunities for further credit pumping is quite limited. Inevitably, there'll be correction, just like correction of the problem of bad debts and limited growth of credits. This is painful thing. We know because of our Russian experience, it has to do with the cleansing of banking system, because of the stagnation in real terms, shrinking of credit portfolio. It will be like a slowdown effect on economic growth. At the same time, if we talk about rebalancing of the revenues and redistribution of revenues for the sake of population, it also related to the consumer crediting in China. Obviously, there'll be serious limitation of barriers. Everyone expected big shock in China, especially the mortgage crisis, especially developers' projects. Now, against the backdrop of the problems of a stock market, the problems became secondary, and the real estate prices, as I see, are growing. But this is like a clockwork bomb, and it will play a negative or hindering impact on the midterm future. For us, very important, because for Russia and for any country that is trying to solve the problem of development, this is the structural reform issue, and the structural reforms not only of institutional kind, but having to do with the change of the structure of the economy, in infrastructural projects as well, environmental projects. In essence, we are to some extent standing before the same challenges and problems, although they have different nature, different from China. If China invested huge money into infrastructure, including railways and automotive roads, we are lagging behind in terms of investment volume compared to GDP. That is also quite interesting in China's experience, and I think that in the future, substantial part of infrastructural projects in Russia will be realized with participation of the Chinese capital, and we can see through the projects that are in real discussion, the project with the high-speed rail between Moscow and Kazan city, and the project related to the development of the production of LNG and the port of Sabeta at Yamal. For us, China is interesting not only because it can be a trading partner. If we look at 15th year, turnover of trade dropped by 17%, more than the turnover with other countries, between China and other countries. This fact is quite worrying. I think the raw materials trading should be changed. At the same time, what in my understanding is very important, that is China is interesting as the partner, as the participant of the infrastructural projects and high technology projects. The other challenge is that we hold negotiations for years and years. We have many plans, such as the plan of declared of joint production, development and production of the wide-body aircraft, because we have serious work done about this airplane. We don't have resources, but these are the plans that are being discussed for a number of years, but they remain on the paper. We have so many problems related with the mutual trust and simply limited experience or the number of successful projects. In fact, almost don't know any successful projects completed. There is technology transfer that happened in defense sphere, but as for joint production, such as like we have in India, we don't have with China. We have quite limited experience of joint production of the civil industry. China is trying to enter automotive industry of Russia, but for now, it's quite challenging field, greenfield, because the crisis at the automotive market here, and so many partners, and so much investments from all world, Japanese, American, German, and other brands. However, it seems to me that the problem of investment partnership in any case has great future, beneficial not only for Russia but also for China. China in any way still was pure importer of capital, now is starting to become exporter of capital. It happens in organized form because in the recent years China, its state institutes actively acquired raw materials and assets overseas. Number of our partners at the end really are controlled by Chinese. When we prepare composite wing for MS-21, The Austrian partner that was used now is also already under Chinese control. Obviously, the fruits of this work will be used together. China will also benefit from this. However, such serious breakthrough in investment partnership, even at the level that we have with Germany and Japan, we have not achieved. And this is the window of opportunity that we can use. Because of that, I would probably say this: for Russia, China is really serious challenge, not just because there is the growth dynamic slowdown for the oil prices, not more important, but rather the development model. Will be China growing at 6% level? If it will be under 6%, it's still they have dynamic growth. It's huge market where Russia is present very in limited scale. We didn't use window of opportunity in 2000. That was used by Japan and European Union, that became chief investment partner and trading partner of China. In this sense, we should develop our own export model, export of technology and goods with China. But this technology has to do with joint investment project. And then Chinese growth, even if it's 5%, 6%, will be serious locomotive for the Russian economy. If you look at the world forecasts, they speak of, they promise low growth rate at 2%. I think that we can develop with higher growth rate at 4 or 5%, but this is possible only if we create serious export potential. In that sense, we'll be able to substantially improve our position in the Chinese market. Thank you. I must ask question to Alexander Voskresensky. Andrei Nikolaevich pointed at a number of the problems of the interaction with China. You are a practitioner in the government. What to do, how to correct the situation, considering what our international colleagues said about the Chinese situation? What does Russia government has to do doing something about interaction with China? Especially what Andrei Nikolaevich said. Andrei Nikolaevich said that we didn't use the opportunity in the fat years and come to Asian markets. It's true. It happened for many reasons. In many ways, it was inertia of post-Soviet times. I'll remind you, at the period of exacerbation of the Cold War, our key trading partner was Western Europe. Infrastructure of communication, including economic collaboration, it worked for a long time. Communication with the Western world. At the same time, we will not fool ourselves. Till 21st century, the flow of investments and technologies came from the Western world, but not from Asia. Now situation is turning around, and Asia and Pacific is not just market and money, it's also technology's place. Really, perhaps we're trying to catch the train while it's on the run, running fastly. That you can talk. Fast-running train is Asia. I think we'll have mutually beneficial situation. But at first, I'd like to say the following about Chinese economy. We're part of the global world, and whatever is happening in the world context. Recently published numbers about world trade for the 9 months of OSCE. I'd like to mention those numbers so you can understand the context of what is happening. The drop of export in this country is 20.4%, import 20.8%. The drop in Europe, 13.2% of export, 14.5% import. Germany 12%, Japanese 18%. It's all minuses. In our case, our trading drop, Brazil minus 16%, Australia minus 21%. What does it tell us? It's new normality or reality. It's the environment that we have to consider. In any case, situation in the world economics is changing. Last year was quite significant. That's the subject of another plenary session. We have new trading blocks, the completion of negotiations about Trans-Pacific, 13 countries with 36% of the world GDP. Let's see how this trading bloc runs. There is no China or Russia in this bloc. However, once again, let me tell you that this is some kind of new reality. Russia is not lagging behind in this agenda. From the 1st of January of the last year, we have Eurasian Economic Union. Now we have 5 countries, and first time in the history, the free trade zone. I think Andrei will tell us a little more about Vietnam. Is one of the most dynamic countries in the Asia Pacific, and this region will be under our attention. Now, as for China specifically, concrete collaboration, really, as in one anecdote, they said, we should use your problems for ourselves. If the China grows at 6.3%, any other percent still growth. Still, China is number 2 economics in nominal way. World Monetary Fund said that China has great potential. The ASEAN within the last 15 years is growing at the growth rate of 5+% per annum. The growth, the potential opportunity for our goods, opportunity for investment from there, investment to there. So it's quite pragmatic. We act by improving and enhancing the collaboration with this partner. What is done? What challenges do we face? Really, Andrei Nikolaevich was rightly saying, it's not lack of trust, but lack of knowledge about each other. The knowledge at the economic subjects, that's why so little success. Although they're emerging, let me tell you right away, since we have the scientific audience, considering the building we're at. Yesterday night, together with the colleagues from Analytics Center of Forum, we launched AsiaVector.ru, analytical website for the people, such as experts and entrepreneurs, for businessmen, for officials who are interested in Asian agenda. There are several analytical materials. We placed preliminary short analysis of the content of the Trans-Oceanal Partnership and potential implications for Russia. Also, by the way, there's analysis of Chinese reforms. There's express analysis of reforms and impact on Russian economics. However, how do we interact with China? How do we see interaction further? We have got, just like a moderator said, the manual controlled system. We're talking about the follow-up. If we have success stories that can be foundation for our future success. What happened recently? I think 2 significant transactions and deals that never happened before in the sphere of the energy. It's Yamal LNG in terms of investment. In the sphere close to energy, such as petrochemical, is the Sibur and Sinapec. And near New Year, very significant, not so big, but systemically important, is consortium of private investment funds in China, bought 13.3% of Istri-Gok, is the mining enrichment facility. Why it's so important? And why do I point at this? The first story, one big private funds talking with big private company in Russia, they enter as not minority shareholder. It's not a secret. Many state companies from Asia trying to gain control stake in different assets. This is example of the attempt to constructively and emphasize mutually beneficial collaboration at the Bystre mining enrichment facility that will be successful for both parties. They have smaller projects, but I think they characterize where does investment collaboration go, what sectors. For instance, the N+ company built data processing center in Siberia together with Chinese partners. And the scheme is quite interesting. They buy Chinese equipment, together with Chinese equipment, they buy Chinese consumers to this data center that is located in Siberia. This is an example of collaboration of absolutely new industries. The same what Andrei spoke about. We started building in Lipetsk of the automotive factory, Lifan. Chinese fact. We'll see how it goes. There are small investments, production of the refrigerators in Tatarstan, but this is only beginning. Such projects begin in what seems to be important to us, that we have success stories. What do we pay attention to? We discussed it many times with our partners. Because of difference in mentalities, like in 90s, Western companies invested, they faced with problems. They happened to reach important offices in the government.
And protect their rights in courts, both in Russian and international, and to solve quickly their problems. Asian companies, they do not want to bring their problems out. And especially in the 90s, there were stories of failure. Business partnerships between Chinese companies and from other countries in Asia and with Russian companies. And now we turn over this old page and we can demonstrate how we can work from the new and show the success stories. That is what was concerning the so-called manual regime. I would also include such systemic things like removal of barriers in our cooperation. And last year, a special protocol was signed with the government of Russia, and interests paid from Russia to China and vice versa are not subject to taxation. And that protocol was signed last year, and this year we can take advantage of this protocol. And this is also a big systemic cooperation which relies on the project of the leaders of our countries, a joint declaration signed by Mr. Putin and Chairman Xi, the Eurasian Union and the Silk Way, and we work tightly and intensively with the Eurasian Commission, which has a broad agenda, including the transport corridors, cooperation and investments in transport corridors. Such projects are being calculated and estimated, removal of trade barriers, and also things which were commented by Mr. Lin, cooperation in technologies. And there was a meeting at the level of the chairman of the governments of Russia and China, and Chinese side expressed the idea from simple steps of cooperations to come to a joint structuring of added value projects. And the same was discussed in the framework of the work which is done concerning the project of the economic consequences of the Silk Way. And of course, we should not expect fast wins and successes. Our pragmatic agenda in Asia is long-term, and what's happening in the global economy and Asia-Pacific region should be taken into account. And I'm about to finish. Even in traditional branches, I'm talking about energy sphere, analytical review was made, and people were questioned about the situation, and we are talking about the 40% of consumption of energy resources, and reviews and analytical reports show that we see a growth of more than 30% of energy consumption in the Asia-Pacific region. And basically, inside the structure will be changing. The share of coal will be reduced and the share of gas will be increasing. And so we can structure our policy in line with that. And speaking about the data on our trade with China, I have described the downfall in the global and bilateral trade also shrinked. But we are changing the structure of our commodity trade over. I'd like to give you a few numbers. We reduced the share of mineral raw from 78 to 71%, and export of foodstuffs increased 23%. Chemical industry grew 8%. And we actually achieved the targets which were set. Raw materials share is reduced, and more added value commodities are being sold. And the world is not standing idle, and lots of changes take place in every segment of the economy. And proceeding from these changes, we have to structure mutually beneficial trade, to adjust the regulations of the market, what we are doing today. And the Chinese companies Alibaba and JD.com help us to remove the barriers for exporting small Russian business to Chinese consumers. And now this kind of export is impossible because the customs, the export deal at the customs, it's a new reality. And the email commerce is growing, and there are many problems, logistical problems, bureaucratic problems, but together with partners, we will remove such barriers and on a mutually beneficial ground. And Chinese companies are most interested to receive Russian products for Chinese consumers, and the first precedent already took place in the fourth quarter of last year. As a representative of the American market, I'd like to ask a question, Denis Valentinovich. For many Russian structures, a very important thing is industrial cooperation, the network deals, and access to the Chinese financial system, including for Gazprom Bank and for other financial institutions in line with the international sanctions. How justified are these expectations, and how volatile is the situation on the Chinese money markets and fund markets, and how it affects Russian companies? Last year, we never saw any public deal or transaction of placement of stock capital or equity. No, it never happened. I will respond in a reverse manner, starting with the debt market of China, which is of great concern to everybody, but my personal opinion that there is no reason for a radical concern. For this process which takes place has a systemic character, but understanding that this is a young market of equity market, and I will tell two words, perhaps if the audience aware of that. In my opinion, Shenzhen and Shanghai and Hong Kong stock exchanges are completely different. They have different investors, and different companies are approaching those grounds. And if you analyze statistics before the last week, and I don't think the trend will change, and after this June crisis, Shenzhen Stock Exchange capitalizing, there are 70, Shanghai 25, in Hong Kong 12. That was the peak of the sales. And this is speculation history. And if we come back after crisis, Shenzhen 46, Shanghai 19, Hong Kong 11. Before it was 12. So this slash and fall, which are of concern to financial experts, actually this is different, structurally different, both for continental China and for Hong Kong. And the main reason for that is Hong Kong is not subjective to that trends because they have big, huge companies which are not over-appreciated, and they work with continental China. Is the situation different? And basically, low interest rates and tremendous savings reserves in China and low interest for deposits, and people were trying to approach to some kind of acceptable profitability. First it was a bubble of real estate, then with the help of the state control they attempted to minimize the consequences, and people moved to the stock market. And now having this tremendous mass of non-qualified investors, because they are individuals and with the national specificity, people they are subject to panic if everybody starts panic, so it grows like a snowball. And this is also the fund market of the continental China. This correction is not a disaster or a catastrophe. It will actually continue, and January will show the same trend, especially in the continental China. And the third reason we have to mention the state authorities of China, perhaps not very successfully, because they are trying to find new mechanisms, but they start to regulate the situation more actively than it was in the past. And those declared market reforms, the openness of the fund market, conversion of yuan, and privatization of the state companies, which will happen in 2016. Even more companies will come and more emittents will appear on the market, and the market will grow, and the unqualified investors will continue to be present there, and so will have a kind of up and down tendency. But China learns very fast and makes very successful attempts to accelerate training of the investors, and they will definitely reach a success. And a very important trend here, this fund market was separated from the actual economy, and funding and raising of money for companies were made by the banks, and a great number of participants also made the situation more difficult. And that was declared also on the 22nd of December for 2016. And a lot has been spoken there, and I'm sure it will have positive effect.
And the last point before the Russian story and how it impacts us, that's going to be the shadow banking. This is really something, in my view, looks like something, and that people not talk much, and the public bodies in China don't speak much, but the analysts speak a lot. But there's no eligible program incarnated in the form of document. What to do about huge number of the shadow banking in China? How to fight with this? In essence, all of this is some sort of, let's say, is not the reason behind the crisis, but the catalyst that will rock the boat if there are structural problems, of which many people spoke in our panel, many speakers spoke. If they don't reveal, such as bad debts in general and shadow banking, that the state cannot handle and decide what to do about it and how to properly build policy about it. That is not known to wide circles of people. And this is the catalyst of the story. Summing up of what I said, big number of the low qualified investors in China, big number of the potential investors, and the reorientation from the banking financing to the stock financing, and the shadow banking will be the tendencies that in different level impacting stability of the stock market of China. I think all of them will create volatility, all of them. Will they cause catastrophe? I don't think personally so, because 3.3 trillion of reserves, there is still a capacity to even up, smoothen up, and the state banks, finance state enterprise, they look at the covenants differently. If there is a central policy, the covenants can be reviewed, and slightly default waves that rocks the stock market, they can be taken. Now, briefly answering the question, how does it impact Russian issuers? The Russian issuers not easily can come to Chinese markets. There are restrictions. Russian exchange rate, the Moscow exchange is not acknowledged in Hong Kong. Russian Federation is not accepted as jurisdiction for secondary placement, secondary offering. That's the problem of first offer. The procedure works like this. First, I make the order, and the regulator determines jurisdiction as acceptable, and from that moment it starts working properly. I don't expect any problems here, as that will have acknowledged exchanges, and also Russian Federation as jurisdiction, and as soon as Russian issuers are ready to correspond to requirements of Hong Kong or Shanghai exchanges, definitely they can come to Hong Kong. I don't have any doubts about this. Technical problems, they will be there. And Hong Kong requirements of the Hong Kong exchange quite serious, even more serious than the Moscow exchange. At least observation requires, there's so much requirement. Will the turbulence of the market hinder from coming to Hong Kong exchange? The companies with 70% of annual, it comes to right division of middle and large companies, that's in Shanghai or Hong Kong, they will not participate in turbulence. So there's demand for the new names, and for the Russian raw material segment will be evaluated, properly appreciated. The last point, as for the impact onto the Russian reality, very important, and it seems to be very sympathetic to me what Russian government does and the central bank does, such as the softening of procedure of the bonds issue, determination how this yuan to ruble swap can work, how the central banks conclude I think this process is very appropriate because it creates the foundation upon which the corporates can build their successful strategy. Investbank finished in 5 minutes before the regulated time. I can speak for another 5 minutes. In 5 seconds. Andrei Alexandrovich Slepnov has joined us, the Minister for Trading in European Commission. He will leave Commission and come back to Russian government. But he committed his last years to building trading policy inside of Euro-Asian Commission. One of the recent big initiatives is the merger with the Eurasian Commission and Silkway. And based on Putin's declaration, they talk about creation of the free trade zone, as far as I understand. Presidents of the European Asian countries commissioned to elaborate. So first question, what is happening now? If you can evaluate the Chinese economics in terms of the trading with the European Asian countries, we'll be thankful if you give us some numbers, because trading with Russia is one thing, that there's growing trade with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on. Thank you. Really, today's discussion and the news flow in the world shows that China is being paid attention to. Many people with great attention and worries discuss what is happening. People are concerned. Although seemingly the growth at 7%, under 7%, around 7%, doesn't give any reasons to believe that there's recession or coming to zero, but everyone is concerned anyways. Why so? Really, this is a feeling that the model that functioned for the last 10 years in China, that for the last year substantially determined development of the global economics starts changing. This is the feeling that is fair, and the assessment is that model is changing, and the implications of this change are quite serious. But the model, let's say, what is the most important is the reliance on export, reliance on WTO as the floor where you can promote your commodities, reliance on certain instruments for attraction of the global capital from transnational companies, intellectual property, and so on, and development of export, specifically export, I would say more than real cooperation. And now this model starts slowly skewed. Is that because of the global factors or purely Chinese factors, right? I would say that it's a mixture. Transformation of the global trading system. This is certain decrease of competitiveness, in particular of Chinese goods and investment conditions in China that was spoken of before, and some geopolitical factors that are also important because China has become either first or second economy, and it's clear, cannot be unnoticed, and it causes certain reaction that comes outside of the economic agenda. The changing of the trading system, the slowdown of Doha round, and understanding that WTO cannot give steady basis for the following boost for economy, it has become obvious factor. Even more so from this factor, they switch to the implications. The implications are reforming of the regional blocks with much more advanced disciplines, conditions, openness, in such a way we can say that if we rely on integration, then the global integration is some kind of foundation, but all the principal results can be achieved as part of the trading blocks on the regional level with more deeper rules, and most importantly with different philosophy. Not just opening markets and then whatever happens. We arrange cooperation chains. We understand how the capitals travel, how the roles are distributed in the chain, in this regional cooperation chain, how the consumption function. If you read the recent big agreements, the most sensitive items are spoken of. In such a way, it is clear that the challenge for China is how will they find answer to this globally changing structure, because reliance on WTO that China realized in early 2000s and gained good dividends from this. This game starts being a hindrance rather to the dividends. Further, about competitiveness, much was spoken of and much was written about it. Of course, China is attractive because of its market, because of the great infrastructure and the labor market, but one labor market clearly is not enough to lure investors and make attractive environment. You need different philosophy, different transaction forms for investors to make this process of attraction of investment and keep it attractive as it was before. And geopolitical factors, of course, also very important. It will be more and more influential. We see that politicians, politics, there's more politics in our relationship. They come to the forefront. we slightly forgot how it was at the end of 20th century. Now we start recalling influences us, Russian Federation influences other countries, of course it influences China. Much is spoken of about this, of course. In such a way, there is a bundle, all of this, the political influence on the investors' behavior. We see certain methods and mechanisms of influence, such as economical and purely directive tools, instruments. But as to purely Chinese factors, of which you heard today, we don't have enough basis, reasons to think that Chinese government cannot handle with technical objectives, among which the debt management and stability of financial system. I believe it's technical objective for China, and Chinese government sees those risks and makes necessary steps. There's no reason to worry that they will not handle it. The same I was say about slow shifting towards internal demand, and also I would list as technical diversification of cooperation chains with external partners, such as switching from pure export to certain cooperation basis with reliance on capital export. Reliance on capital export, it was declared, and this policy started. The Silk Way also started. That's one of the revelations of this policy. These are quite serious, but still technical objectives, much more important to find reliable form of growth. And this objective is for China and for us. It's common objective for both of us. At the new period of world trading system, world global economic system period, it should be realized as full-grown cooperation between interested or stakeholders, between interested partners, to find the formula of growth and build cooperation alliances, if you wish, which would allow to realize global advantages. This is really a challenge that goes beyond the framework of one government. It takes discussion in broader organizations, because in general sense, what do we have now? We have understanding that protectionism of the early 20th century, the purely protectionism, even best way done, cannot provide reliable foundation as national component for growth. The same is true for fair conditions. It's full liberalization, full openness. It doesn't work. What happens? Reliable middle ground is good alliances and building of fair cooperation chains. In that sense, we see a number of the questions. We're really, the presidents, actively discussing connection of the Silk Way and Eurasian Union. There's declaration. We're starting negotiations regarding the agreement between China and Eurasian Union. The first round should take place in the coming months. We have understanding in relation to this agreement. We perhaps will not zero down the tariffs, but we can come to this. By the way, we will not switch to the tariff liberalization, not just because we're afraid or something else. We adequately evaluate all gamut of risks of coming to Chinese markets. Has to do with the conditions of fair external and internal crediting and technical regulation and different tariff barriers and many, many interesting items that are subject of separate big conversation and serious concerns. The second question is trust. Trust between us and China is not banal thing. China is big. China is growing fast with its mentality. Question of trust must be regulated, and this is objective of the Chinese government, because partners should believe that China is ready for fair cooperation. It has to do with intellectual property rights protection, has to do with the real access to the market, and the fair condition of cooperation between enterprises and many, many other things. And the last topic, in relation to the further steps, I'd like to draw attention to the initiative that was declared during the SHOS, the Shanghai Collaboration Organization, the big, ambitious answer in relation how we see development of the unification of resources, such as countries of the Shanghai Collaboration Agreement, China, India, Eurasian Union, and the countries, observer countries such as Iran and Pakistan. Along with them, we have other tracks. We have discussion regarding trading with India. Just 2 weeks ago, I went to Tehran. We have very good conversation. We switch to the practical steps. Just 2 days ago, there was request from Pakistan, the repeating request, if we are able to build full-grown partnership related to the fair cooperation, I think can be serious response that will be foundation for steady development.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Natalia Stapran. Response to what? I believe we are talking about DTP, if everything will be approved and how it's going to influence the Chinese economy. I simply wanted to express two theses which we hear in Russia. Perhaps they're not right exactly, and the number one, that PP is created for the isolation for China, and this is not a good characteristic of this process, because the Asian participants of the Trans-Pacific Cooperation, they will not cooperate if China is going to be isolated. And analyzing the text of this agreement, the American business which stands behind this agreement, actually it writes down fairly comfortable conditions for Chinese business, and the interests of large Chinese business is already a part of that agreement. And second thesis is that China has to generate its own partnership versus Trans-Asian Pacific Cooperation. Chinese government is very open in this respect and builds up the agenda, the Shanghai Organization on Cooperation, and it's a very important factor of having a so-called double play. You have to take into account your own interests, because openness to the Trans-Pacific agreement and the interests of China should be taken into consideration. And this adds the argument in favor of China being interested, and I think it is wider, broader, but more simple, this integration, instead of broader and deeper. I think this is the challenge for China. China is ready to act on the Shanghai Organization on Cooperation and also on Trans-Pacific Partnership. And China is very actively leading the negotiations with the European Union. But as far as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where there is Anglo-Saxon experience practice, China is oriented to cooperation on some specific infrastructural and logistical projects, and that's what we see. And I think here we will see the first results on this cooperation, and Russia will get involved in this and will offer a strong alternative. colleagues, we have very little time left, and we would like to be right on time. What I propose now is
time. I suggest that I pose just 2 questions to you, Justin, and 2 questions to Mike, because you are rare birds here, and we want to nourish a little bit our knowledge about China. And then we open up like for very quick Q&A, like 10 minutes.
Можно я вопрос задам?
Да. Okay.
I would like to ask a question. I apologize for interruption, and the question to our colleagues, since the been declared an agenda for reforms, and China adheres to that agenda, and it is very ambitious. Liberalization of tariff regulation sector. And what do you think, understanding what is happening and political changes, centralization of market, the situation on the stock exchange, how to react? Are you sure that this agenda will be exactly followed as it was started in 2013?
Let's do like 3 minutes. Justin, you go first, then we have Mike.
Well, the performance of the stock market in China rarely reflect the economic reality in China. From the year of 2008 to 2014, China was best performing economy in the whole world. But the stock market performed one of the worst in the world in terms of its return. And now certainly the economic growth rate declined somewhat. But from the 2014 to 2015, there was a sharp increase in the stock market index. And you can see the disparity between the reality of the Chinese economy and the stock market performance. I think the stock market often were influenced by a lot of psychological issues. And since many people were pessimistic about the Chinese economy, certainly that put a downward pressure on the stock market. But fundamentally, the Chinese government is committed to further opening up of the Chinese economy, furthering the market-oriented reform. But I think that at the same time, it's important to maintain the stability of Chinese economy. I think the vision and direction of China's reform are clear, but the implementation of the detail of steps will have to be contingent on the real economy and domestic situation and international situation. So that's my response to your question.
Mike, third plenum.
I agree with Mr. Lin. Oh, sorry. I'm a technological wizard.
Оно выключилось опять.
Oh. Thanks. Does that work? Yeah. I agree with Mr. Lin. If you look at the stock market and GDP or any measure of wealth that you like, you see almost no correlation. So don't interpret what happens in the stock market from the point of view of predicting future growth. What really matters is what it implies about credibility, because we know that when you've got high levels of debt and unstable balance sheets, what keeps it together is the credibility of the guarantor, which is ultimately Beijing one way or the other. So we should really focus on the credibility issue. As for the reforms, if you look at the third plenum reforms from October 2013, they all implicitly do the same thing, which is one way or the other, they involve a transfer of wealth from the state sector to the household sector, whether it's the residency reforms or the pension reforms or the financial sector reforms, et cetera. And those are absolutely the right reforms. The problem is they're politically very difficult to implement. So I think there is a clear understanding of what has to be done. I just think, and we should have known this from history, that it's politically very difficult to implement them, and that's really the task of the Xi administration.
Could I add up something?
Sure.
I like to differ from Michael somewhat from his understanding of the Chinese economy. Actually, his analysis added to the pessimism about the Chinese economy. From his presentation, basically, he has two theses. One is that the investment-led growth in China is not sustainable. The high debt in China is not sustainable. And since those kind of message has been a consensus in the world, and so many people think the Chinese economy is not sustainable. But let's look. Certainly all the high-performing economy in the catching up stages, they all have high investment rate. And certainly many countries, their investment will drop. Like Japan, after 20, 30 years of very high investment growth, and then they come to slow down in the investment. And Michael, refers that to if you sustain the investment for a period of time, then you will have a situation for the possibility to make investment. But I think you forget to distinguish Japan in the case of China, and China with other countries. Because other countries, when they slow down their investment, they were already high-income country. Their technology and industries are on the global frontiers. But China, today, is still a middle-income country. China still have a huge opportunity for industrial upgrading. China can also further improve its infrastructure, because if you come to Beijing, you can see so much congestion, and also infrastructure can further improve. China also needs to improve the environment, and China also is on the stage of urbanization, because currently urbanization rate in China is only 55% of the population. For high-income country, their urbanization rate will be exceeding 80% of the population. So from this analysis, China still have many, many good opportunity for making economically high return, social high return investment. So I don't think that investment in China is saturated as Japan when they reach the declining of the investment, or Korea or other high-performing catching up economies. So that's one difference. I think Michael did not really, to see this subtlety in the difference. Secondly, high debt. Whether high debt is sustainable or not. And Michael mentioned high-income country, they can have high debt. And lower-income country, they cannot sustain to have a high debt. And I think that this may not be a very good way to understand the sustainability of debt. I think the better way is to understand whether the debt is used to support consumption, or the debt is used to support the investment which improve the productivities, the investment which can contribute to the further growth of the economy. If the debt is used to support consumption, which does not contribute to the productivity improvement, it's not sustainable, no matter it's in a high-income country or in a low-income country. We know the 2008 global financial crisis was triggered by the high debt in the US. Certainly, higher-income countries, they can sustain high debt for a longer time. It's because their currency is a reserve currency. So they give their central government the ability to inflate the debt. And a developing country, if they borrow to support their consumption, then those kind of debt is not sustainable. However, if debt is used for productivity enhancement type of growth of the debt, I think a developing country can also to have a higher debt ratio. And Michael said that in his study, he never see the debt reversal in the history. I like to give him one example of debt reversal. In 1998, the government debt as a percentage of GDP is about 25%. And in the East Asian financial crisis, the government adopted a very aggressive fiscal stimulus to create domestic demand and to maintain around 8% growth between 1998 and 2002. And then because of the high government debt, the debt ratio in China increased from 25% up to 36%. However, those kind of debt was used for improvement of infrastructure. As a result, the growth potential in China increased. From 2002 and to 2007, the growth rate in China was two digit, exceeding 10% for continuously for about 6 years. As a result, the debt ratio in China declined from 36% down to 22%. So there's an evidence of debt reversal, in the history. Thank you.
Got you. Mike, it will be unfair to deprive you from an opportunity to respond. So 2 theses, 1 minute each, if that's possible.
To have a serious discussion would take several hours. Sure. What I would suggest is a couple of things. The first question, which is that China is too poor to have too much investment. If the only countries that had overinvestment crises were rich countries, that might make sense. But actually, most of them are quite poor. Latin America in the 60s and 70s had a whole series of these investment crises and are relatively poor. The key, and I'm not going to pretend to give you the answer, the key is to ask what is the difference between a rich country and a poor country? Is a rich country rich because it has a high level of investment? In which case, to make a poor country rich, we simply should raise the investment level. Or is a rich country rich because it has a high ability to absorb investment productively? In which case, it's not so much how much investment you put in, it's really what are the legal structures, the financial structures, et cetera, that allow you to invest, that allow you to absorb that investment productively. I won't try to answer the question, but it seems to me that that's the question. Mr. Lin is absolutely correct that debt for consumption is not productive. Debt for investment is. What I would submit to you, though, is if you borrow 100 kwai, 100 renminbi, and invest in a project that is worth 50, that creates 50 renminbi in value, then you've really got 2 types of debt. You've got 50 of productive debt and 50 of debt that is the same thing as consumption debt. It is debt that hasn't created value, with one big difference. When you borrow 100 renminbi and consume, you don't increase your asset values. When you borrow 100 renminbi and invest in a project that's worth 50 renminbi, you should increase your assets by 50. But in China, you increase them by 100 because you never write stuff down. So we have a double problem in China. We have much of this investment is as bad as consumption investment, but it's left us with overstated asset values. And then, my God, when I'm jet lagged, I always lose track. The last point you made was?
There was an example with
yes.
on the Chinese side.
I don't think that is an example. That's the case. For me, that's a very classic case. China resolved its debt problem at the turn of the century. How did it do so? It did so through financial repression. The lending rate was lower than the GDP deflator. It was a negative interest rate, right? So when you resolve a debt problem with a negative interest rate, or when you resolve it by inflating it away, you're basically transferring wealth from net savers to net borrowers. So the debt was forgiven, but it was forgiven on the backs of Chinese households. And if you look at household income or household consumption from 2000 to 2010, it was very low, not the lowest in history, but very low. By 2010, it was the lowest ever recorded in history. The household share of GDP collapsed. So basically, yeah, that's how the Americans do it, that's how the Europeans do it. You have a debt problem, screw the household sector. But we can't do that again in China because the household share has to grow. It can't collapse. So that way out doesn't work. That was more than 2 minutes, I'm
Okay,
sorry.
I have unfortunately to stop this wonderful discussion we just picked up, and I hope we have a chance to continue it and still give the audience an opportunity to ask 2 questions.
Ты говори, Саш, по-русски, а то мы тебя отправим в Китай работать.
Хорошо. Я могу и по-китайски. Коллеги, если у вас есть вопросы, 2 вопроса мы можем принять, коротких, очень четких, сфокусированных, и называйтесь, кто вы. Если есть вопросы, тяните руки. Если нет, мы дадим возможность Джастину и Майку еще обменяться парой панчей.
Нам не ломай тут дискуссию.
Есть вопросы? Похоже, что
Все понятно.
Justin, you're leaving. Все? Окей. Тогда на этом я закрываю нашу дискуссию. Спасибо большое. Си-си-си-си.